Clerk, will you please take roll?
Senator Atta. Senator Uggan. Senator Castro. Speaker Cruz. Senator Espadon. Senator Esteves. Senator Lee. Senator Morrison. Senator Munoz. Senator Nelson. Senator Rodriguez. Senator San Augustine. Senator San Nicolas. Vice Speaker Terlahi. Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Majority Leader, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I move to approve the legislative journals dated February 19th, 2018 and February 22nd, 2018, subject to corrections.
On the motion to approve the legislative journals dated February 19th, 2018 and February 22nd, 2018. Are there any objections? Hearing none, motion is approved. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are communications and petitions, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion that communications and petitions be appended to today's journal, hearing no objection, you're recognized, Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are messages from Imagalahing Guahan, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion to append the messages from Imagalahing Guahan to today's journal, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are reports of standing committees, and I move that they also be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion that reports of standing committees be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objection, carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are no reports of select committees.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I move that bills introduced, bill numbers 248-34 through 259-34 and 260-34 COR through 275-34 COR, and resolutions introduced, resolutions numbers 352-34 through 367-34 and 368-34 COR through 389-34 COR, and certificates introduced, certificate numbers 224-34 COR through 226-34 COR, 227-34 LS, and 228-34 COR through 238-34 COR be deemed to have been given their first reading.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move to excuse senators not present for today's legislative session.
Hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, I move that all congratulatory, commendatory, and condolence resolutions and legislative certificates introduced today for the remainder of this legislative session be considered to be first read and adopted, to allow the Legislative Council to make technical corrections, and to add all senators as co-sponsors.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the committee, the following legislative concurrence items. I move to place from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation the nomination of the following: Roberta M. Abaday to serve as Community at-Large Member of the Guam Commission for Educator Certification with a recommendation to do confirm. Dr. Lisa Baza Cruz, EDD, to serve as member of the Guam Commission for Educator Certification with a recommendation to do confirm. Mr. Earl J. Garrido to serve as a member of the Cockpit License Board with a recommendation to do confirm. Mr. Edward B. Palacios to serve as a member of the Cockpit License Board with a recommendation to do confirm. From the Committee on Health, Tourism, Military Affairs, and Senior Citizens, the nomination of Gregory J. Cruz to serve as a respiratory therapist representative of the Guam Board of Allied Health Examiners with a recommendation to do confirm. Okay, so now. Ms. Alicia C. Ogo as an occupational therapist representative of the Guam Board of Allied Health Examiners to do confirm. Dr. Keith M. Horinucci to serve as a nutritionist representative of the Guam Board of Allied Health Examiners with a recommendation to do confirm. Okay, I'll get back to that. From the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, the nomination of Anthony C. Lujan to serve as a member of the Cockpit License Board with a recommendation to do confirm. From the Committee
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the previous nominee that was just highlighted by the good senator, the appointment of Anthony Lujan to the Cockpit License Board, I would like to express my opposition to that particular appointment, not because of the personality and the ability that he can contribute, but because of his place of employment. I've held a position, even in a previous appointment, where in fact an unclassified employee in the government of Guam should not serve in our boards and commissions, specifically because they could otherwise be influenced. So I retain that same position as it applies to the appointment of Mr. Lujan. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Do you object to it going to the voting file? Are you objecting to it going to the voting file, or just objecting to the nomination? Yes.
So putting it in the voting.
It's opposition, not objection.
Okay.
It's an objection, or is it an opposition or objection?
It's in opposition, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
So that opposition would be duly noted at the time
Yes.
of voting. Okay. All right. From the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security, the nomination of Richard T. Gutierrez. The following nominations: Richard T. Gutierrez to serve as a general public member of the Guam Real Estate Commission with a recommendation to do confirm. The nomination of Dr. Jeffrey C. Johnson to serve as Commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission with a recommendation to do confirm. The nomination of Peter B. Montinola to serve as a Commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission with a recommendation to do confirm. From the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement, the nomination of Austin J. Duenas to serve as a member of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, with the recommendation to report out only. Senator Hagan, do you have an objection to this? Do you have an opposition to this also? Austin Duenas, he's a... You're not objecting to that? Okay. The nomination of Chantel T. L. Tichira to serve as a member of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission with a recommendation to do confirm. From the Committee on Culture and Justice, on the following nominations: David R. Duenas to serve as a member of KGTF/PBS Board of Trustees with a recommendation to do confirm, and Ms. Laura M. Torres Sauder to serve as a SINA representative of the COSAS Board of Advisors with a recommendation to do confirm.
On those nominations, going to the voting file, is there any objection? Hearing none. Mr. Majority Leader, you recognized.
So, Mr. Speaker, we're down to the second reading file.
Okay, before we leave motions, did I understand that there were two individuals that wanted to be recognized in motions? Senator Snodgrass.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place bill number 159-34 as amended by committee, an act to amend section 6102 of Article 1, Chapter 6, Division 2 of Title 17, Guam Code Annotated, relative to extending the duty to send children to school from the age of 16 years to the age of 18 years.
I'm sorry, we were in legislative concurrence, so a motion to go back to motions is approved. Go ahead and make your motion.
So repeat it?
Yeah. You
Yep.
have to move to go back to motions.
Oh. No, we're still in motions.
No,
No, we're not? Oh.
we were in legislative
Then
concurrence.
the motion to go back to motions, then?
Hearing no objection. Hearing no objection, we're in motions.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place bill number 159-34 COR as amended by committee, an act to amend section 6102 of Article 1, Chapter 6, Division 2 of Title 17, Guam Code Annotated, relative to extending the duty to send children to school from age 16 years to the age of 18 years.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place bill number 160-34 COR as amended, an act to amend subsection I-13 of section 715, chapter 7 of Title 1, Guam Code Annotated, relative to converting the 180 instruction days required each school year of the Department of Education to 1,260 instructional hours, basically an equivalence of the 180 days.
On that motion? Hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place bill number 161-34 COR, an act to transfer lot 5173 new 2-2-R2 known as the Tamuning Multipurpose Field and a portion of lot 5173 new 3 from the Chamorro Land Trust inventory to the jurisdiction and responsibility of the Tamuning Mayor's Office.
On that motion. Thank you. Senator Nelson, did you wish to be recognized in motions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place bill number 226 onto the session agenda. An act to amend subsection A15 of subsection 12802 of Article 8 of Chapter 12, Title 10 Guam Code Annotated, to add a subsection 12802 Alpha 16 to Article 8 of Chapter 12, Title 10 Guam Code Annotated, and to add a new Article 26 to Chapter 12, Title 10 Guam Code Annotated, relative to establishing certification and licensure requirements for the massage therapy industry on Guam under the oversight of the Allied Health Board.
Any objection?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to add Bill number 145 onto the session floor and onto the session agenda and to substitute it as substituted on the floor. And that is relative to removing the requirement that the Guam Housing Corporation appropriate a sum certain from its revenues to ensure a reserve balance every fiscal year, and to authorizing fees imposed on the sale and transfer of interest on real property to be deposited into the Housing Trust Fund program.
Thank you.
Thank
Any
you, Mr.
objection? I'll remind colleagues, we have 5 days, so I'll expect everybody early and keep the discussion relevant and short. We've just added 5 new bills. Those 5 are going at the end of the calendar. Senator Espaldon, do I understand you have a motion?
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. I move to place Bill number 243 onto this session agenda also.
And 243 is?
243, in essence, is the bill concerning the retirement supplemental plan, and that's basically to mandate that all retirees who are under Medicare Parts A and B be required to enroll under the RSP plan for the government, thus saving $3.4 million at the very minimum to the government of Guam.
Thank you. On that motion.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, just I guess procedurally, I should have said notwithstanding the House rules. So, but I still move the same motion. Thank you.
Hearing no objection. Okay. We're now back, well, we're now on second reading. The first bill on the agenda is Bill 34. Senator Addett, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I move to accept Bill 34-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Environment, Lands, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform, and a version that is substituted on the floor.
Has a substituted version been circulated?
They are circulating it now. So, Mr. Speaker, while the substitute version is being circulated, I would further move to place Bill 34-34 COR as substituted on the third reading file, and I would like to discuss it. So what you see in the substitute version is the highlighted portions are the additional changes that have been made, and so instead of making amendments as we go along, I'm just putting it all on this substitute version.
Is there any objection to accepting the amended, as substituted version? We'll take a short minute. in the interest of time, I'll allow everybody to be reading. Let's go to Bill 62, then we'll come back to 34. Give everybody a chance to look at whatever they're doing, and we'll deal with this land exchange.
I think, Mr. Speaker, I can very simply walk everybody through easily to see where the changes are.
All right. Please.
Okay. I may proceed.
Hearing no objection.
Mr. Speaker, Bill 34-34 actually makes changes to legislation that was passed back in the year 2013. And what this legislation, which was Public Law 32-40, what it does is it provides a uniform standard relative to the duration of commercial leases, permits, or licenses for the use of GovGuam real property and related facilities. The current law establishes 5 years as a reasonable term limit that an autonomous agency or the governor can enter into a lease agreement of public lands or related facilities. However, so the current law establishes that 5 years as a reasonable term limit. However, it also recognizes that longer terms may be warranted in order to allow investors to make their return on investments. Public property and facilities are assets owned by the government of Guam. Hence, there must be transparency in these transactions. And contracts with terms greater than 5 years should be required to be scrutinized by the legislature. Bill 34-34, as substituted, seeks to make amendments to Public Law 32-40 based on feedback received from the stakeholders, primarily the government agencies. The amendments to the law are as follows. One, you will see on page 2, at the end of subparagraph B, it states there that the determination of need shall be valid for 2 years or until an exceptional term contract is executed, whichever comes first. And basically what that does is that today an agency may decide that there's a need to go out there and lease out for a long term its properties for development, and recognizes that it will need to lease this asset out for a long term. And then it may decide that after they've gone through that step of the process that, oh, we really don't need it right away. So it sits there, and the way the law is right now, it could sit there, this determination of need, basically that part is completed, and it could sit there for maybe 10 years. We've seen cases where the government made a decision and then nothing happened after that, and then 30 years later it pops up. And so we're trying to at least address that particular possibility in this determination of need. So it's basically saying you issue a determination of need now that you've got this property, you want it developed, and it's going to be leased out long term. You have 2 years to do it, or if you execute a contract, long-term contract, then whichever comes first. But at the very most, action, the issuance of the determination of need must be followed by action. Then, secondly, we need to clarify certain items in the bill. So, in section 1, paragraph B, it lays out the sequence. Before you go out and solicit a long-term contract for a piece of property, you must first issue a determination of need. So that determination of need, so let's take, for example, the Guam International Airport. It's got lots of land up there that basically will sooner need to be developed. So the board of directors will issue a determination of need, which is to be transmitted to the speaker. All it says is that, for example, it may say, we, the board of directors of GIAA, determine that a need exists for the development of the following airport-related facilities, and it lists it out, and that GIAA property is available for long-term leasing to accommodate such developments. And basically what that does is that it informs the legislature that says, okay, we're getting ready to go and lease out this public asset for a long term. Don't be surprised when the contract comes down to the legislature for your disposition. The second thing that, that it clarifies is that the determination of need is to be made a part of the solicitation document. So when they send out an RFP soliciting for the development of certain properties that are airport-related facilities, this determination of need must be made a part of the documentation. Thirdly, the lease contract shall be transmitted to the legislature. Oh, I'm sorry. So the determination of need must be issued first. Then after it's been transmitted down to the legislature, then they can issue a solicitation for development. After they've then, completed that procurement process and they enter into a lease agreement, a long-term lease agreement, that lease agreement must come down to the legislature, and the committee chair, having oversight of that particular entity, must then conduct a public hearing, and the legislature will have 60 days to either approve or disapprove. It's either we like it, approved; we don't like it, disapprove it. We can't go into the lease agreement and start tinkering with it, because then that's really, we're interfering with the executive responsibilities. And so on page 3, you'll basically see there on line 6 that the chairperson of the legislative committee having oversight jurisdiction during the 60-day period shall report its findings and recommendations to the legislatura. But then the additional language was added there on line 9, is that when that committee chair calls for a public hearing on this lease agreement, the time is tolled, the clock stops, that 60-day clock stops for as long as it takes to put out a notice for a public hearing, conduct a public hearing, complete the committee report, and report it out to the body. And then, so that basically are the changes that is being made to the current Public Law 32-40. And so what I've done is I've highlighted there the items that were further being changed or amended after the committee had reported out the bill.
Any senator wish to be heard on the main motion? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the intent of the author to ensure that we don't have these dormant use intentions pop up years later. I wanted to clarify my reading on page 3, because I'm not quite sure exactly how the mechanics work, and I would yield either to it as a question to the author or to legal counsel. My reading of it, starting on lines 1 to 5, those two sentences that encompass those lines, is that the matter shall be put to the legislature as a whole, and within 60 calendar days from that, the contract, lease, permit, or license shall be deemed approved by Legislature and Guahan. But then if you go down to lines 9 through 12, the new language would read the 60-day period allowed for the legislature to approve or disapprove the contract, lease, permit, or license shall be told from the time that a public hearing is noticed and the committee report is completed. And so I'm trying to understand, does the 60-day clock start immediately upon receipt, the 60 calendar day, or does it start from the time that a public hearing is noticed and the committee report is completed? Is that when the 60 calendar day starts? And I think it's very critical to understand this, because when those contracts or leases or permits come to the body and it gets referred to a committee, if the committee elects not to even have a public hearing, would that prevent the 60-day clock from even starting altogether? So which is the operative time frame? When does the 60-day clock start? Upon receipt by Legislatura, or upon scheduling of the public hearing and the filing, and the completion of the committee report?
Do you yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield. So the 60-day time clock will commence upon receipt of the lease that has been sent to the legislature for its disposition. So as soon as then the secretary logs it in, the clock starts. Now, to the point about if the committee chair decides not to do a public hearing, that is really not an option, because you'll see that on line 5, it says that a public hearing shall be conducted. And again, it's being made prescriptive because we want to make sure that there's transparency on this long-term leasing of a public asset. Now, that 60-day clock stops when the committee chair has then issued out a notice, a public notice for a public hearing on a bill to either approve or disapprove the lease. And the clock stops for as long as it takes to get through that notice, to conduct the public hearing, and to report out the bill from committee. Once it gets reported out, the 60-day clock starts again. And then whatever is remaining of the 60 days, that's how much time the legislature has to act on it. And if it decides that it will approve the lease agreement, it would do so by enactment into law. And if it recommends disapproval, it shall be by resolution.
Does that clarify it, Senator?
It does, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the clarification. My read of this is that the contract, lease, or permit or license will come to the legislature, and the chairperson shall conduct a public hearing, but there's no mandate for them to actually report out the bill within a specific time frame. And I'm still not certain that the way lines 9 through 12 is written makes the public hearing and the time it takes to file the committee report inclusive of the 60-day clock. I think if we're trying to make it be a 60-day only window, we need to kind of change some of the language on line 10. But I'm trying to understand if that's the intent. Is the intent to make the committee process inclusive of the full 60 days or exclusive of the full 60 days? As in, the 60 days does not start until the committee report, the public hearing is noticed, and the committee report is completed. If I could defer to legal and have request a minute.
Legal's requested a short recess to address this. legislature back in order. Senator Abbott, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think to address the concern that has been raised by my colleague, I would like to make the following amendment on page 3, line 11, so that then it reads, from the time that the committee report is completed. So by eliminating the words, a public hearing is noticed, and what it does then is the clock stops when let's take we can take a minute recess.
We're in recess. We're back in order.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make the following amendment on page 3, line 11, so that it reads, this is with respect to when the tolling begins. So on line 11, it should read, from the time that a public hearing is noticed and until a committee report is completed. So that identifies when the clock stops, when it starts again, and that's when the committee report is completed. And a committee report is not complete until it's been reported out of committee and transmitted to COR, according to our standing rules.
Is that clear? All right, thank you. Senator Nicholas, you still have the floor. Any other senator we wish to be heard on the main motion? Senator Uggan.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much.
Hold on a second. I guess I didn't add. I didn't take action on the amendment. On the amendment by Senator Ada to insert the word "until" on line 11. Is there any objection? On the amendment, Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment, I think, is better than the original, but I would ask the sponsor to consider whether we really want to say shall be told until the time that a public hearing is noticed and the committee report is completed. I think it's been my experience that it's getting harder and harder to schedule public hearings, and the whole intent of the underlying law is to make sure that there is a public hearing, to make sure that the legislature acts on it, and I would like to give the legislature adequate time to do that. But once the committee's done the committee report, then the 60 days should commence. Otherwise, I have no objection to this amendment, Mr. Speaker, but I think I would ask the sponsor, we could also add it to the beginning of before the public notice. Because otherwise, the 60 days could um, I think, well, yes, see, without any action, within 60 calendar days, it's a default disapproval. I mean, sorry, default approval. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, could I ask for a 1 minute recess? Okay, well,
We stand in recess.
thank you.
Legislation is back in order. Madam Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I remove my objection to the amendment. Thank you.
The motion to withdraw, no objection. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? Oh, yeah, that's right. You have the floor, Senator Reagan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And buenos dias para hamjuda hogus and todos and adona mangaigi gini. Mr. Speaker, just a couple of questions. And first and foremost, I did have a sidebar conversation with the legal counsel in regards to this particular proposal because it's dealing specifically with contracts in excess of 5 years, whether there will be any direct implications with a court case that is presently before the judiciary. And I was assured that by virtue of any passage of this legislation that it would be prospective in application. So that concern has been addressed. The one question I have, Mr. Speaker, if I may, with the sponsor of the legislation, because I'm reading the section that we just concluded some of our conversations on, and that's subsection D. And it's a similar concern that was just shared by the previous speaker. On line 4 and 5, or 2 to 5, it reads, if the legislature in Guam takes no action to approve or disapprove within 60 calendar days from the date of filing with the speaker, the commercial contract, lease, permit, or license shall be deemed approved by a legislature in Guam. So taking that, and in the same paragraph, it also requires, like the sponsor of the legislation shared with us, it requires that in fact a public hearing be conducted and that the time is going to be suspended between the date of the public hearing as well as the conclusion of the report. But then it goes on to read, Mr. Speaker, lines 12 to 14. After the completion of the committee report, it says, recommendation for legislative approval shall be by enactment into law, and then a subsequent sentence, recommendation for legislative disapproval shall be by resolution. So I'm trying to reconcile, Mr. Speaker, and also with the sponsor of the legislation, I'm trying to reconcile that paragraph because, like I shared a little earlier, the first sentence reads, shall be deemed approved by a legislature in Guam, and then the last two sentences of that paragraph reads, recommendation for legislative approval shall be by enactment into law, and then it also reads, recommendation for legislative disapproval shall be by resolution. So can someone please clarify and help me understand whether in fact it's an automatic clause for approval once the committee report is reported out, or is there going to be a required subsequent action after the committee report is reported out on this particular, on any measure, and it would either require legislative enactment or legislative disapproval by resolution. So, Mr. Speaker, if I can ask the sponsor of the legislation to help me understand exactly this process and how a piece of legislation would be enacted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Do yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the language on lines 12 and 13, where it reads recommendation for legislative approval shall be enactment into law, and recommendation for disapproval shall be by resolution. Because then in the committee report, at the end, the committee recommends either to approve or to disapprove. So then if the committee recommends to approve the lease, then the next step will be to get that particular bill on the session agenda for the legislature to vote on. If the committee recommends disapproval, then all it needs to do now is just circulate a resolution, and that's the end of it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I understand the simple presentation in terms of approval enacted by the legislature, disapproval, but then there's still that caveat of the sentence that reads specifically on lines 2 to 5. Within 60 calendar days from the date of filing, the speaker, the commercial contract, lease, permit, or license shall be deemed approved by el legislature en Guahan. So if the committee chairperson conducts a public hearing on a measure, recommends to approve, the sponsor of the legislation saying it has to go before the body to be enacted. And then also the sponsor of the legislation says in the same token that if the recommendation by the committee is to disapprove, then it shall be disapproved by resolution. So where does the previous sentence, the automatic approval clause, line up with action by virtue of the committee's activity? That's where I'm trying to understand and reconcile my train of thought. I mean, I may be very simple-minded, Mr. Speaker, in looking at this, but it does say shall be deemed approved if, in fact, within 60 calendar days. So that's where I am trying to understand. Perhaps we just need to reword it slightly so that it's clear, or does the action of the committee and the committee report suspend automatic approval clause? Because there is an automatic approval clause here that I alluded to a little earlier.
Before I get your response, I've been reminded by legal counsel that I failed to take an action on the amendment. With the amendment having been withdrawn, is there any further discussion or any objection to the approval of the amendment until the word, just the word until, stuck in there? That would be the St. Nicholas Amendment. I just need to. Oh, I'm sorry. It's the ADA Amendment.
Madam Speaker, while the legal counsel is trying to resolve some of these issues, can we just take a recess? I don't believe we've taken a recess.
Yes, 2 minutes recess.
Thank you.
We're back in session. Senator Uggan, you had the floor. You yield to,
Please, Madam Speaker, if I can yield to the sponsor of the
all right.
legislation.
Senator Atta, do you yield?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to make two amendments. First of all, to
all right. Okay, Senator Atta.
so,
I guess notwithstanding the rules will allow you, because Senator Uggan has the floor right now.
oh, okay.
He's yielding to you, yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and the good senator sponsored the legislation. Madam Speaker, there was a sideline conversation with legal counsel, and I believe that the amendments that will be proffered by the sponsor of the legislation would address that. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
All right, is there any objection to having Senator Atta speak? Okay, Senator Atta, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So on lines 12, 13, and 14, I would like to make the amendment by striking out on line 12 from the word recommendation to line 14 to the word resolution, to strike out those three sentences.
On the amendment, is there anyone who would like to speak? Is there any objection to the amendment to remove these two lines? Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just to be clear, on line 12 to 14, we're striking all the lines?
Two sentences.
No, where it says recommendation.
Recommendation for legislate.
Just the two words?
The entire sentence, right?
Correct, starting from the word
Yes.
recommendation.
Okay, all the way to line 14. The two
Yes.
sentences will be stricken?
That's correct.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Any objection to the amendment? No. Senator Nelson? Can you speak on the microphone?
Hi, Madam Speaker. I don't have an objection, but I do have a question if the proffer will yield.
You may speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The amendment proposes to remove these two complete sentences. Recommendation for legislative approval shall be by enactment into law, and recommendation for legislative disapproval shall be by resolution. If we remove these two lines, the amendment made to the current law is the recommendation for, but now we're striking out the legislative approval shall be by enactment of law, and legislative disapproval shall be by resolution. We're striking out that checks and balances. Is that correct? Is there a specific reason to why we would forego this process?
Would you like the Senator Atta to yield? Senator Atta, do you yield?
Yes. So, Madam Speaker, the lines 12 through 14 really just kind of elaborates on how the legislature's decision is to be conveyed. But you know, really, we conduct a public hearing shall be conducted. We don't conduct a public hearing. That implies that a bill will have to be introduced to either approve or disapprove the attachment A, which is the lease, right? And so that's going to go through the entire process, and ultimately the legislature will vote on that bill.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't know if, please correct me if I'm wrong. So, naturally, we do need to have a bill so that it can become enacted into law, but now we're removing the process for us to solidify whether we approve or disapprove the contract, lease, permit, or license for the determination of need. So we are removing that process as well. We're removing the concrete documentation, the concrete process for whether the legislature approves or disapproves a determination of need or contract, lease, permit, or license. Is that correct? I just want to make sure this is clear.
Are you asking the sponsor
Yes,
to
I'm
yield?
I'm-
Senator Ada, do you yield? All right, he doesn't yield. So,
Okay.
please proceed.
Point of information on that issue, and just for
Do you have information to provide, Senator?
Yes, in order, I understand our colleague's concern. Basically, what she is saying, that if we delete these two last sentences, then what is the action that's going to take place? And I believe that and again, just to expound upon the authors.
Senator, would you like to speak on the amendment?
Well, she was asking on this amendment, and that's why I'm kind of trying to provide information, knowing the rules of the House and parliamentary procedures, what will happen. I believe it was explained by the author. In essence, because a public hearing is mandatory for this bill, then to be able to have a public hearing, you need to have a bill present. And once that's reported out, that bill will either be voted up or voted down. There would be no requirement for a resolution to disapprove, because just by the act of not voting a bill into law or into enactment, then that in itself would be an expression of the disapproval.
Senator Nelson?
No, yes, I understand that. But now the amendment is to remove the bill process even from the current law itself. So we're removing that piece also. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
On the amendment to remove the two lines for legislative approval, Senator Uggan?
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the sponsor for considering that particular provision, those particular provisions being deleted, because now it would revert back to the automatic approval clause specifically. In light of a public hearing, that after the committee concludes the committee report and the clock starts ticking, so to speak, within that required 60-day time frame, now the legislature would have more than ample time to be able to literally either present the initiative before the body in legislative form, in legislation form, or allow that particular contract to be able to term out as authorized by this provision. So I thank the sponsor for making these proposed amendments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
On the amendment, is there anyone else who would like to speak? Speaker? No, all right. Senator Ada, would you like to close on the amendment?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just have one last amendment, and that is an amendment that will...
No, if you'd like to close on this amendment?
Oh, no, it's fine.
All right. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry. So Senator Ada, on the amendment. So did you want to close on the amendment? All right. So on the amendment to remove the two sentences, is there any objection? No objection. So ordered. Senator Ada.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to make just one final amendment, and that is to tie in the public hearing, the process, the flow of how things will go, wherein the lease is filed with the legislature, and then the way it reads on line 5 there is that if the legislature does nothing in 60 days, it will be deemed approved. But then there's also that sentence that begins on line 5 that a public hearing shall be conducted. So we've got to tie those two. And so I'd like to make the amendment that on line 5, it will read, deemed approved by a legislatura in Guam, comma, and add the words, provided that a public hearing shall be conducted. So the automatic approval provision does not kick in if a public hearing has not been conducted.
Senator Cruz, Speaker Cruz on the bill, on the amendment by Senator Ada to add the words provided that on line 5.
Madam Speaker, that is the reason why I came to the floor to speak. I really have major problems with automatic approvals. Whether you put it automatic approval, unless you're going to have a hearing, and then there should be no automatic approval. It has to be a positive action by this, an action by this legislature to address this issue. Having this thing, if it's not acted in within 60 days, it's automatically approved unless, it just convolutes it even more. The problem with this whole section is that one line. It should either be removed and just go straight to a public hearing shall be conducted. There's a mandatory hearing and then a mandatory action and all that. But having that automatic approval throws this whole section out. And I would object to the amendment that is being proposed in favor of one that I will make after this one on removing this whole automatic approval section.
On the ADA amendment?
Madam Speaker, I'm going to withdraw that amendment.
All right. Thank you, Senator Ada. On the bill, Speaker Cruz, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I then move to amend line 5 to read the commercial lease, permit, or license approve or disapprove within 60 days of the speaker receiving the contract of the lease, permit, or license, and put a period there. There should be a permit. Just a permit after speaker, and a public hearing shall be up to a public hearing. So we'll strike the words, the contract lease permit shall be deemed approved by the legislature of Guam. Strike those words and just go from within 60 days. No, just take out that whole line. Take out that whole line and just from line 2 to line 5, strike if legislatura takes no action within 60 days. Just go, a public hearing shall be conducted by the legislature.
All right, before we proceed, is everybody clear what the amendment is to delete the lines from the sentence from lines 2 through 5 that begins with if legislature in Guam and ends by on line 5 with legislature in Guam? All right, Speaker, please proceed.
What I'd like to do, Madam Speaker, with the amendment and with assistance of legal counsel, I'm not sure if that whole sentence needs to go, but there can be no automatic approval. This legislature really needs to take an action. And I'm glad that they have a provision in here that a public hearing shall be conducted, and it's mandatory, because we have to have a hearing to determine why this determination of need is and whether or not it's a good thing to do. But there has to be a hearing, and there can be no automatic approvals. It's got to be an affirmative action taken by this legislature to approve or disapprove any lease without default to an automatic approval by inaction.
On Speaker Cruz's amendment, is there anyone who would like to speak? Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I have no problem with that. However, if you take a look, if we remove this sentence, then the rest of the paragraph also needs to be amended and corrected. So I move that we set this bill aside for now so that the mover of the amendment could perhaps make an amendment in total of rewriting this whole paragraph so that we don't have to go word by word, line by line. In other words, to reflect the intent of the amendment, it needs to be in totality as opposed to piecemeal. So I move that we set this bill aside so that an amendment can be prepared to really address this situation properly.
On the motion to set the bill aside, is there any objection? There's an objection. All in favor, please raise your hand. You okay, Rin? Clerk, are you all right? Oh, you ready? All right. All right, so the bill's set aside. The next bill on our agenda is Bill number 62. Senator San Augustine, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move to place Bill number 62-34 CR as amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform on the third reading file. I'd like to discuss it.
On that motion, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, the municipality of Barrigada desires to use and maintain for public purpose lot NAS Gagnon 19, which was conveyed in perpetuity. Furthermore, it is understanding the Barrigada Mayor that the property shall not be sold, leased, assigned, or otherwise disposed of, and that the Barrigada Mayor will continue to provide related recreation facilities and services for their various sports organization. We found that on March 7, 1995, the Barrigada Municipal Planning Council submitted its comments on the Comité Paratizan NAS Reuse Master Plan. They presented an alternative course of action for the KPT to review, and that they request that additional public land be transferred to Barrigada so it can utilize said lands as parks, sports, and recreation facilities. They have filed the necessary documents known as the Tijan Barrigada Foundation to serve and provide public benefits, education, recreation service to our residents, to their residents. This approach is supported by the Mayor's Office, the Municipal Planning Council, and that the Barrigada position was based on the fact that the community has proven its experience in parks, sports, and recreation facilities, maintenance, management, and especially because Barrigada has no public parks, recreation, or sports facility in its name. My colleagues, I know that if this bill is approved, the Mayor's Office is aware that it comes with a cost. There's a cost of maintaining the baseball field, the football field, and the whole facility is actually starting to clean it all up. And I have advised the mayor that I hope she's ready, that if it is approved, don't be asking for more money from the legislature. Work it within your budget. And they understand that.
On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to reflect in the record that I rise in support of the measure. Thank you.
Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just, I have no problem with transferring it to put it in the jurisdiction of the Barrigada Office of the Mayor of Barrigada. I just want to put in the record, though, that it is made clear that now by taking the jurisdiction of this particular field, that will represent approximately, just for the baseball field alone, those fields represents about an additional $10,000 a quarter for electricity to keep those lights burning. So I don't know what other expenses might be incurred to maintain that area there. I understand that there's the basketball building. There's another organization that had actually pumped in something like about $2 million. I understand that something has been worked out already so that they maintain, that organization maintains jurisdiction. I'm not sure what was worked out. But the important part is that I want to put on record that this would be an additional $10,000 expense just for the fields per quarter on top, and that will be taken out of the municipality's village funding, I presume. This was also done, I understand, in Inarajan, where the Inarajan basketball court there was I believe put under somehow the Parks and Rec went in and to reduce their expenses. They basically stopped paying for the lights to the basketball court. So now the mayor's office, I understand, is having to pick up that burden. So I'm just want to put that on record that this transferring of jurisdiction comes at a cost.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Ogden? Any other senator after Senator Ogden? Senator Munoz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that there's been several pieces of public property, including baseball fields, as well as parks that have been transferred to the jurisdiction of the mayors. And I just wanted clarification because even inclusive of the previous speaker, he had brought up some possible additional costs that would have to be incurred by the office of the Barrigada mayor. So if I can pose a question to the sponsor again in terms of how these costs would be assumed by the mayor's office moving forward after the passage of this particular legislation. And then I do have a couple of other questions, please, Mr. Speaker.
Do you yield?
Mr. Speaker, as I spoken to the mayor of Barrigada and the vice mayor, they said they're going to work that out, the costs associated with that. They just needed the property so they can do what they need to do to bring, basically have a Barrigada sports facility like you have at Benarman. They'll be able to meet all the costs and all the expenses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for that response. And I only asked that question because in terms of the eventual use and possible leasing of different components of this property, that authorization perhaps should be incorporated into a piece of legislation such as this, because we're talking about 43 plus acres with not only a tremendous number of real estate, but real estate that could continue to benefit our community out there. A couple of other questions, Mr. Speaker, I have is the reversionary clause. I understand that the way it reads right now, the office of the Barrigada mayor must begin construction and refurbishment within 5 years from the date of enactment of this act. And it's either we give the office of the Barrigada mayor administrative jurisdiction and care of this particular parcel of property without the reversionary clause. I have every trust and confidence that the mayor, based on the provisions incorporated in here, regardless as to who the mayor is and the vice mayor, that they're certainly going to comply with that. So I do have a question with regards to the reversionary clause and the requirement that construction and refurbishment take place within a 5-year time frame, because that's going to require that they identify resources to take care of the ongoing costs. We heard about the cost of power associated with some of those facilities in Barrigada, approximately $10,000 a month. And that's one component. And then now this provision would stipulate that within 5 years, construction and refurbishment would have to commence. Otherwise, the property will revert back to the government of Guam. So in regards to this, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to look at giving administrative jurisdiction to the office of the Barrigada mayor and leave it at that, rather than having the reversionary clause, because there are already facilities in there in which the Barrigada mayor is going to have to maintain. So I'd like to move for the deletion of section 3 and just outright provide administrative jurisdiction to the property that's being highlighted here, the 43 acres. And then I have one other amendment, Mr. Speaker, if I may.
On the amendment proffered by Senator Uggan to delete section 3, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess this is the time to rise on this measure. Not with respect to particularly the amendment alone, but just also the measure in general. The constant communication that I've heard from the mayors, and that's been publicized by the mayors, is that they have a lack of resources. They even don't want to cut the grass at the schools anymore because they don't have the resources. And I'm having a difficult time reconciling these kind of inconsistencies where we want to give 43 more acres for a mayor to manage when they constantly communicate to the public and to this body that they don't have the resources to manage the responsibilities that they already have. I've heard mayors say that they have too many mandates on their books. And I would be of the mind that we should be doing the opposite of what this bill entails, and we should be removing the responsibilities so they can concentrate their resources and stop using a lack of resources as a reason why they're not able to meet the needs within their communities. It needs to be put on the record, Mr. Speaker, that the way the mayors divvy up the money that's appropriated to them is that they sit down and they decide who's going to get how much. And it's not proportionate to their populations. It's not proportionate to their village needs. They just divide it all up. So when we add more burdens to any particular village, I just grow very, very concerned that today's good idea is going to turn into tomorrow's unfunded mandate. And a mayor coming back saying, you gave us all this responsibility, how come you're not giving us more money? So with respect to the amendment and the reversionary clause, I think it's just taking the whole measure even further down a path of concern for me, because I feel like the entire bill is counterintuitive to all the communication that we've been getting from the mayors. If they don't have enough resources as a group, and if they're the ones deciding how their existing resources are getting divided, then why are we going to be adding more responsibilities to any one municipality? Because that will become a shared responsibility of all the municipalities. And that means that a responsibility that we put on one village is going to be a burden that's going to be borne by another because of the way they divide up the resources that are the financial resources that are already allocated to them. So it's in that context that I'm uncomfortable even removing the reversionary clause. And I'm further uncomfortable with that because I'm not even quite sure what it is that this reversionary clause was related to. This Barrigada Municipal Planning Council plan that was submitted on the Komitea Partizan was in 1995. That was 23 years ago, Mr. Speaker. I think I was a sophomore in high school. So for us to even be able to base the ability for the mayor to absorb this responsibility on a plan that had pricing and layouts and decisions that were made in a 1995 context, I just think it's very difficult for me to take comfort in that, especially with the communication that we've been receiving 23 years later, that they don't have enough resources to meet their existing mandates. So I respectfully object to the deletion of the reversionary clause, but in the context of the greater bill. I don't understand why we're moving this measure forward in light of all the communication that we've been receiving from the mayors at large, given the fact that the mayors at large are the ones determining how the budget is for the entire municipal needs of this island. And if one mayor doesn't have enough, why are we giving another mayor more to be responsible for when we can't even afford what we already have on the table? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator, on the amendment, Senator Castro, did you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I rise in support of Senator Uggin's proposed amendment to strike the reversionary clause. While I respect the previous speaker's sentiments, I think the accurate number of years has been 25, and I take a very different approach to looking at the measure. I can't speak to other mayors' concerns about how they manage their respective municipalities, but I think this is something worth pursuing. I think anytime you can provide a mayor the opportunity to be a lot more entrepreneurial about the natural resources that are provided to him or her in stewardship, and they're able to develop that, I think that's a wonderful thing. I think it may be worth noting for the record already that the incumbent mayor is already providing that kind of maintenance services for those adjacent areas. And the MPC, as well as the mayor and the vice mayor, individually and collectively, have submitted their ideas in terms of how they're going to maintain and sustain, and if not even further generate additional revenue based on those properties' availability. Further, I do to some extent share the sentiments of the previous speaker in that I'm a proponent of decentralizing the control of these properties to the mayors. I mean, in terms of less control from a central government perspective, the record also reflects, at least the mayor's testimony reflects, the kind of support has not been provided by the executive branch in one or more areas. And so I think that if she's willing to put her best foot forward with the support of the residents, people like myself and the council, then I like to challenge them, because there's nothing to preclude this body from coming back and relinquishing control, just taking back the property in its entirety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. After Senator Nelson, on the amendment for the removal of the reversionary clause, and then Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you would just indulge me, the amendment is to remove the entire section 3 on page 2, which is the revisionary clause. The office of the Barrigada Mayor must begin construction and refurbishment within 5 years from the date of enactment of this act. In the event the property remains idle and the office of the Barrigada Mayor does not begin construction and refurbishment within the stipulated time frame, administrative jurisdiction of the property shall revert to the government of Guam. Mr. Speaker, I object to the removal of this clause. I do support the bill, but the removal of this clause, it's easy to it's easier to add on than to take away, and this, I think, provides a checks and balance also for the people, because we need to do away with government practices where everything we do is just, it bypasses the system, and this gives the incentive to whoever owns this property, whoever will receive this property, that they must have a plan of action for the said property. And it would behoove us to ensure that construction and refurbishment is being done on this property. Many times, as a normal citizen, we don't know what's going on with the different parts of the properties on our island. Perhaps even sometimes in the legislature, we don't see the actions of certain autonomous agencies so clearly. And to remove this clause, I feel, will be taking out another checks and balance system that the people elected us to ensure what is done for the betterment of our community and our island. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do have a question for the author, not of the amendment, but the author of the bill. And the question will be, and I'm hoping he'll yield, the question is, what kind of construction and refurbishment are we talking about? What is being mandated here? Or what is, why is that even included in the bill?
Do you yield?
Mr. Speaker, as I've spoken with the mayor and the vice mayor, they plan on actually clearing up all the property. That's the first thing. The next thing is they want to upgrade the football field, and they want to upgrade the field further up. There's a lot of stuff that happen up there. And if you look on the section that talks about the removal of the reversionary clause, I actually believe that the mayor is going to start construction as soon as this bill passes. We're going to start seeing some improvements up there. First from the football field, then they're going to work their way all the way up to the top and start clearing up all that debris that was left from the carnival, from the municipal planning, from the mayor's council, not Barragata mayors.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the sentiment, but it didn't answer the question. The question is, what specific construction or refurbishment needs to happen up there on this property? If there is none, if it's just a matter of clearing up debris, boonies, say for example, that's not construction, and I'm not sure that's even refurbishment. So again, to be able to address the issue of whether we should remove the reversionary clause, and the reversionary clause says that construction and refurbishment must begin within 5 years, we need to know what kind of construction and refurbishment we're talking about. And so that's really to the heart of my question. What kind of construction and refurbishment are we talking about?
Thank you. I'm not sure we're going to get anything further. I understand what you're talking about, that there's, in some other bills, it's listed earlier what construction, but this one doesn't have.
Right. And the point here then is, if we cannot clarify or specify, then even just the construction of a shack to perhaps sell soft drinks out of satisfies this reversionary clause, in that they've done something, they've constructed something, or even just the replacement of a plank on one of the bleachers satisfies this clause, and that there will be no reversion. And again, that's why I just really try to understand what construction refurbishment we're talking about, because it seems that without any specificity, right, that's all the mayor's office would have to do. Build a little shack. They have, that would improve the area, so now they can sell their sodas out of this little shack, or provide shade for somebody, and that satisfies the construction and refurbishment clause. And so there would be no reversion back just by that small act alone. I'm still not sure where to go on this one, on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On the amendment, did you wish to speak against Senator Nelson on this one? On the amendment to strike Section 3, any other senator wish to be heard? If not, you may close, Senator Gunn. All right, is there an objection to? There is an objection. Okay, there is an objection. All those in favor of striking the reversionary clause please indicate by raising your hand. Motion to strike fails. Senator,
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. I guess that's really more or less the message that I wanted to impart is there's going to be a requirement. There's a requirement here for the construction and refurbishment, and we need to ensure that we know exactly how these construction or refurbishment is going to be financed, or that the reversionary clause be reconsidered. But, Mr. Speaker, I have one final amendment that I would like to ask our colleagues to consider, and that is at the end of Section 2, rather than keeping it as a verbiage, part of the verbiage in the legislative intent, I believe it also has to be part of the provision that allows for the transfer of this property administratively to the Barrigada Mayor's office. So rather than running off a few extra copies of papers, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask our colleagues to look at line 6 on page 1, line 6 through 8, where it reads, property shall not be sold, leased, assigned, or otherwise disposed of, and the Barrigada Mayor will continue to provide related recreational facilities and services for the various sports organizations. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move to take that provision and add it at the end of the sentence on line 17, but beginning with THE. So it would read, the property shall not be sold, leased, assigned, or otherwise disposed of, and that the Barrigada Mayor will continue to provide related recreational facilities and services for the various sports organizations, and that would be incorporated into the authorization provision which allows for the administrative transfer of this property to the Barrigada Mayor's office. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask consideration and support from our colleagues on that provision. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
is that amendment clear to all members? In Section 2, starting at line 16, office of the Barrigada Mayor who shall assume administrative jurisdiction over said lot and will continue to provide related,
Actually,
shall
Mr.
not-
Speaker, just add it at the end of the sentence on line 17, just that provision.
Yeah, that the property shall not be sold, leased, assigned, or otherwise disposed of, and that the Barrigada Mayor will continue to provide related recreational facilities and services for the various sports organizations as is contained in the, it's on page 1, line 6. Just move it also to add at the end of 17. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is that clear now? All right. Is there any objection to that? Or anyone wish to speak on it? Senator Lee, then Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify, we're not moving this language, we're just copying it,
Yes.
correct? Okay, thank you.
Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in order to make a informed vote on this amendment, I need to go back again to the sponsoring author of this legislation to ask him, does this bill include the Tejan Gym, which is presently under lease? Because in the end, if this whole property contains a Tejan the Tejan Gymnasium, and is currently under lease, and then we move it to administrative control of the Barrigada Mayor, and I'm not sure how long the lease is to the basketball group that has leased the gymnasium, right? Does that mean that all the investment they put in, which I understand has amounted to over $1 million or $2 million, right? Then this gymnasium will no longer be available to have the lease released at the end of their term. So the question is, does the gymnasium that's presently under lease, right, by the Basketball Federation or whatever that entity is, and the lease is between, I believe, Parks and Rec and this nonprofit basketball organization, Does this property include this gymnasium? Because if it is, then we might have an issue in terms of whether the Barrigada municipality has the authority to extend the lease or to release this gymnasium after this nonprofit organization has already put in several $millions.
Senator, do you yield to that question?
Yes. Speaker, just going over the committee report, during the hearing, those questions, many of the questions being asked today was asked and was answered. There's an MOU with the gym. They will continue the MOU. They've also identified that the mayor has already been talking to Mr. Cobble on what they need to do to make sure that they continue whatever agreement is on the gym and that they don't disrupt it, because that's something that you can't disrupt. And that when they mentioned earlier, first question about the fixing, it's going to be handled by the foundation, Barrigada Foundation, that would take the burden of all the costs.
We'll keep to just the lease on the gym.
Right. And the answer that I hear is that there is presently a conversation between this organization who has the existing lease, and the Barrigada mayor would be willing to work out an MOU. However, if we do support the amendment that's before us, in which the mayor or the municipality of Barrigada cannot sell, lease, assign, or otherwise dispose of any of the facility, then there would be no MOU. Or lease, I should say.
Wouldn't the transfer be subject to current leases?
Right, but again, the
And
issue is,
encumbrances?
I'm not certain how long that lease is. It has not been stated. It was part of the question earlier, but it wasn't stated how long that lease might be. If the lease presently is for 5 to 10 years, and which again, I don't know, then in 5 to 10 years, or however long the lease is supposed to be for, once it expires, right, then the municipality of Barrigada does not have an option to continue the program with this nonprofit. And if this nonprofit is actually catering to a lot of residents within central Guam, as well as, well, actually residents from all over Guam, right, then they, and even if the Barrigada municipality finds the value in releasing it or extending the lease, they don't have that ability if we do pass this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator Uggan, did you wish to speak?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker certainly had a very legitimate issue. And if I recall correctly, legislation was forwarded to this body in which we authorized that particular lease. My understanding of legal implications is that that lease has been consummated for the duration. I believe the legislation, I need to go back and take a look at the numbers, but authorized a 25-year lease subject to renewal and up to 50 years, if I'm not mistaken. So that being the case, this lease will still be in effect in light of the administrative transfer of this property. And the sponsor of the legislation also alluded to the Barrigada Mayor's office making statements and commitments that they will continue to honor this lease arrangement of the use of the basketball court so that it continues to benefit the Guam Basketball Federation, or the organization that presently is leasing it. So I just wanted to provide that clarification and ask for the support of our colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the Uggan amendment, Senator Ada.
So the on that lot up there, there is the building that was used to be formerly used as the casino building. That's part of the facilities that's on this property to be turned over. There's also, I believe, the tennis courts. Now, if we cannot lease it out for a long enough period of time, that building, that we'll call it the casino building, is going to need to be refurbished. But whoever's going to put money into it is going to want, a period of time to recoup his investment. The same thing with the tennis courts. And so if we do not allow the leasing or subleasing, then it'll be difficult to get an investor interested in coming in to invest any money in any kind of refurbishments.
Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just a follow-up to the retiring speaker. I kind of follow his thought process there, is that I think the whole basis of this bill is to provide administrative control of the property to the mayor's office so that she could go out and work with nonprofit organizations, as has been recorded on the committee report, and without any type of arrangement to lease, whether it be cash payments or a return of whoever the lessee is to make these improvements. I don't know how the intent of why we're doing it is going to move forward. I do agree that perhaps not selling, assigning, or disposing of the property is something that we should consider. But leasing, I think that's something that should be considered, because that's how the mayor's office is going to be able to move forward with the plans in developing the area.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify, we're still on the amendment to include the language on lines 6 to 8 on page 1, on page 2, including that into section 2.
Correct.
I rise in support of the amendment. I mean, if it was written into the findings and intent, you're basically saying that that's the whole reason why you're doing this. So if it's the whole reason why you're doing this, then shouldn't it be included in the mandate? And so if the whole reason why we're doing this is so that they can try and implement a 23-year-old plan, and if they state it in the findings and intent, it is the understanding of the Barrigada mayor that the property shall not be sold, leased, assigned, or otherwise disposed of, and that the Barrigada mayor will continue to provide related recreational facilities and services for the various sports organizations, then if that's what the Barrigada mayor understands and what the Barrigada mayor is committing to, then we should include that in the mandate if the property is going to be going under the jurisdiction of the Barrigada mayor. Putting it in the findings and intent does not make it law. It's basically expressing why this bill is being introduced. But if you don't include it as an actual provision where the mover of the amendment is suggesting it gets placed, then there will be no limitations on what the mayor can do with the property. And there will be no mandate that they continue to provide related recreational facilities and services for the various sports organizations. And if the intent is to transfer the property for the mayor, for them to develop it into something else, then let's just be very, very upfront with that. And if that is something that we need to explore, and if that's the reason why we're putting in a reversionary clause, then let's look at some plans and some ideas that are going to be relative to them doing something like that. But if the intent is clearly stated, and that is the understanding of the mayor, and they will continue to provide those services, then we must pass this amendment and include it in the language that is the mandate of this bill. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard by speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise in support of the amendment. I think it really goes to the crux of why we would even entertain this bill at all. We are proposing in the bill to transfer land to a mayor, but I just wonder, the land already belongs to the government of Guam. It's managed by the Department of Parks and Rec, and instead of just transferring jurisdiction or administration for the mayor to, you know, administer these properties, you know, it looks like I'm going to read the language. It says we are going to, the governor may transfer the lots, the 43 plus or minus acres, and to the mayor, who shall assume administrative jurisdiction. I'm never really quite sure what it means when we transfer these lots. Does that mean they have that kind of authority to sublease it? And if that's what is being planned, then I really believe that's something that the government should know about. It's kind of related to the bill that we just passed on file. That what if they enter into a lease that no other government entity is able to enter into right now, because that's prohibited. They, you know, most of those things, they have to come through the legislature for, you know, they have to show a plan. And so I would just agree with the previous speakers and the mover of the amendment that this is really the crux of the matter. If we are transferring land, and I'm afraid now that if we don't pass this amendment, we might be saying that we are transferring the land without any restriction, and that a mayor of a jurisdiction can actually transfer government property. And I think, you know, I think the danger in this, Mr. Speaker, has actually been proven. When I have seen a bill been put in front of the legislature to approve some kind of action that a single person did, and it wasn't a mayor at that point, it was some administrator who purported to have authority to transfer government land. And I think that's absolutely what we do not want. We don't want any kind of authority like that. I think that's not the purpose of this transfer. If it's going to be put into the hands of a mayor, it's strictly for the administration of those facilities. So I support the amendment that it really should be very much set in stone that this transfer does not authorize further transfer, further subletting to a private entity, no less, taking it away from being used by the people of Guam. And here we're talking about Tiden. A lot of people come up to me and talk to me about how they think this is property in the middle of Guam that, you know, should be for the benefit of all the people of Guam. And while I think the mayor has done an excellent job, I just think we have to be careful when we allow any further transfer. So now I'm actually asking my colleagues to please approve this amendment, because after our discussion, I'm afraid that you know, our intent might show differently on the record if we do not approve it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope I'm not trying to read too far into to this amendment or the language here, but maybe I was looking to proffer an amendment to the amendment, but maybe the author can clarify the language here in regards to line 8. I'm not sure what various, I was looking through the committee report, I'm not sure what various sports organizations means. Is that limited to organizations within the municipality of Barrigada, or the territory of Guam, or all sports organizations? Because maybe we need to be very specific here. And, you know, reading even DPR's testimony, I'm sure the management is very aware of when that property was transferred over to the Department Parks and Recreation. There was a reversionary clause in there to ensure that the facilities were to be used for the territory of Guam, for all organizations of the territory of Guam. And should that not occur, that it be reverted back. But so I just like clarification on various sports organizations, and maybe we may have to be specific there to ensure that we're still consistent with the existing reversionary clause that when that was deeded over to the government of Guam. I'm surprised I don't see that in DPR's testimony, and I just want to make sure this is, if it's not limited, and the author can clarify. Maybe we could further enhance this language.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding from the mayor is that once they get control of the field, they will open it up to everybody. One of the biggest problems they have been having is that when they just want to get the Barrigada community to use the field, it's like, let me check the schedule from Parks. There's a lot of negative. Once Barrigada takes control, they intend to open it up to the people of Guam. They're not going to restrict it to just Barrigada. But Barrigada will have first dibs.
So, Mr. Speaker, I thank the author for clarifying that. So, when we're reading through the testimonies from the various organizations here, even the mayor, and they're making it very clear that this is not only specific to only Barrigada, but organizations throughout the island. And DPR mentions here that we do have a northern sports complex. They are in process of working on a central complex. There is a southern property designated for a southern complex that is underway. We're building 2 soccer fields there at this time. So it's confusing because the same area it was being used or as part of the plan as a central sports complex. So, but I know the Barrigada community is full of life with regards to many sports teams and organizations that they field a lot of the organizations with the limited facilities they have. But in light of the testimony, Mr. Speaker, and from the organizations, I'd like to make an amendment to the amendment on line 8 to insert services for various Guam sports organizations.
So the amendment being proffered by Senator Morrison is to put before sports, Guam, various Guam sports organizations. On that simple amendment, is there any objection? Anyone wish to speak? On the Morrison amendment to add the word Guam between various and sports. Any objection? Okay, on the motion as amended, anybody wish to speak? There's been an objection. All those in favor of the argument, we are on the, pardon? He doesn't wish to close. There being none, on the amendment, did you object? No, you didn't. On the main motion, Senator Munya, I didn't forget you. I remembered on the.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. I just have a question, and maybe the author can enlighten me, but looking through the bill, it doesn't really specify, other than in the reversionary clause, that it's going to revert to the government of Guam, but it doesn't specify what agency actually has jurisdiction over this property now. And I don't know if it needs to be in there, that it's going to be transferred maybe in the section 2, transferred from a specific agency to the Barrigada Mayor's Council. So I'm not sure if it needs to be in there. Yeah, so I guess my question would be to clarify which agency has jurisdiction over it, and if it needs to be in the bill.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that Parks and Rec controls all parks, and I'm not too sure we need to put them, to move it from them to the mayors.
I guess my question would be, Mr. Speaker, is if it needs to be in the language here for this bill to be transferred from Parks and Rec to the Barrigada Mayor's Council.
We'll take a short recess. The legal's trying to confirm that. Legislature back in order. I believe legal counsel has advised us that there is no need for this specific mention. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the main motion? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are on the main motion of Bill 62-34. Mr. Speaker, I spoke, excuse me. I spoke earlier with a respective amendment as to some of my reservations of this bill. I wanted to further elaborate on those with respect to the main motion. If my colleagues can reference page 2, lines 7 to 10. The sentence in that section there just befuddles me. It's part of the findings and intent, and it reads, the Barrigada position was based on the fact that the community has proven experience in parks, sports, and recreation facilities, maintenance, and management, and especially because Barrigada has no public parks, recreation, or sports facilities in its name. And it underscores my concern of this overall bill. I mean, to just come out and say that the Barrigada position is that they have proven experience to maintain these facilities that they don't have. It just underscores my overall concern that putting an additional 43 acres for a mayor to manage on top of what they have clearly articulated is a mandate environment that, taken as a whole, is overburdensome, is just not something that I can support. Mr. Speaker, let's put it into context. Imagine if we were to just put these 43 acres to the Department of Education and say, here's a whole bunch of sports facilities, I'm sure the students will be able to put it to good use, here you go. Have at it. DOE will come right back to us and say, we don't have the resources to be able to absorb this additional burden. The Barrigada Mayor's Office, the municipality of Barrigada, while it is its own legal municipality, from a budgetary perspective is similar to it being a division within the Department of Education, in that the Mayor's Council receives a lump sum appropriation and then it gets divvied up among all the other mayors, all the responsibilities in all the villages. Similar to how DOE gets a lump sum appropriation and then it's divvied up based on what the needs of education are, and the divisions get funded from there. We don't mandate individual appropriations to villages. So when we add a burden to one village, it's taking resources away from every other village. And that further underscores my concern with taking these assets and putting them under the management of an operation that's already saying it doesn't have enough resources. Especially because these assets are already under the Department of Parks and Recreation, which you and I, Mr. Speaker, worked to, over the last several terms, become primarily fully funded from the Tourist Attraction Fund. Several terms ago, you and I worked together to make sure that Parks and Rec, which historically was never receiving its general fund appropriation, now would get funded by the Tourist Attraction Fund, the one fund that is always flush with cash. So we're going to take all these facilities, these 43 acres, that are under the management of an agency whose budget is funded because its funding source is flush, and we're going to put it into the responsibility of a mayor that is under a mayor's council that already is canceling grass cutting in schools because it doesn't have enough money. For me, that makes as much sense as that section, lines 7 to 10 on page 2. You can't take something and throw it into a division or an agency, or in this case, a mayor, a municipality, when the resources aren't there for them to be able to manage it effectively. And if the idea is, well, they're going to be able to go out there and do that, based on the way this bill is written, in particular with the amendments, how is that going to happen? Now that we've amended this section to limit it so that those facilities shall be used specifically for those purposes, How is that going to happen? I would love to know so that I can go and tell all the other mayors to go and monetize all of their sports facilities in the same fashion. If there's somehow some magic formula to turn a recreational center, a football field, and several baseball fields and tennis courts into revenue positive assets, by all means share it. Because any other municipality that has these resources, these are all cost centers. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill, don't get me wrong, the Barrigada mayor, I think her community at large will agree, she's doing a very fantastic job. This is not, my statements are not an implication on the ability of the mayor, but they have to do with the fiscal realities and whether or not these kind of measures make sense. I cannot imagine it being too difficult to get access to these facilities for the Barrigada community. And if there is a problem with that, then maybe we should be exploring some kind of mandate in that fashion. Or maybe that's the kind of MOU that should be pursued. Access. But transferring jurisdiction and making this be a 43-acre cost center on the mayor's council that is already overburdened with costs, as they've clearly articulated, it's just not something that I can support, and it's really something that we should not be moving forward in this body. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Espadon, Senator Ada, and Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I'm going to ask the author of this legislation if he would yield to a question. And the question involves, or the question basically is, of the 43 acres, how much do we know how much land is encompassed by the recreation center, the football field, the baseball fields, and the tennis courts? In essence, how much land is not covered, is not included in the recreational facilities? There's 43 acres. And the reason why I need to ask that question is because the Department of Recreation basically supports this bill. However, they state that, again, they ask that the Tejan Gym and any undeveloped land not be included in, in transferring it over to the municipality of Barrigada. So the question is, how much land do the sports fields at present, including the area where the carnival used to be, how much land of the 43 acres does that encompass, if the author would so yield?
Do you,
is that a no, he's not going to yield?
Unfortunately, it's not even in the committee report. The committee report doesn't have testimony from land management that would describe all this, so.
And I need to ask that question because it's not that I'm in opposition to the bill and what it's really intending to do. I know that the village and the municipality of Barrigada is one of those villages that has, as mentioned by the previous speaker, that has no sports facilities. I do know that the mayor and even the parents of Barrigada transport their young people to practice on fields outside their village. Whether it's a baseball team, they drive them down to Dededo. If it's a football team, they drive them over to Dededo, I believe, also. And so they're constantly taking their youth teams out of Barrigada just to be able to practice. So it seems to me there's a logic in allowing the mayor of Barrigada, the municipality of Barrigada, to be able to have some access to recreational fields so that they don't have to go outside their village, they can actually practice there. However, That being said, if there's a lot more excess land that is encompassed within this 43 acres that is not for recreational purposes, and the Department of Recreation, who holds those lands right now, is objecting to the transfer, then we should perhaps strike that compromise. That perhaps the field should go to the municipality of Barrigada, everything else stays with Parks and Recs. I believe that's where it should be. It shouldn't be an all or nothing proposition. I just needed to make that point. And so, because we do not know how much more land outside of the existing recreational facilities is being transferred over, and there is an objection by the Department of Recreation, who currently has the control of this whole property, I'm not sure how I can support this bill just yet, as much as I want to support that those playing fields go to the municipality of Barrigada. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Etta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. I just want to direct attention of the body for those who haven't had a chance to read the committee report, and in the findings of the committee, in the findings that was outlined in the committee report, the committee did ask the sponsor if there was any changes to be made, and as it turns out, there was no changes that was being recommended, and he had asked to report it out as introduced, and that's fine, and that's what the committee did. However, the committee also had brought up to the attention of the sponsor certain issues which never got responded to, but probably needs to be clarified during this discussion. But some of the issues were, one, does the transfer need pre-approval from the Department of Interior National Park Service? That question was asked because in the conveyance deed to Government of Guam, there was a provision in there that made mention of the fact that any further transfer may require pre-approval from the Department of Interior National Park Service. Now, transferring it from Gov Guam to a mayor's office, does that constitute a transfer that will require such pre-approval? I don't know. Is the mayor, the second question was, is the mayor and the Municipal Planning Council assured of the environmental responsibility relative to the transfer? The issues and concerns about the environment were raised when a bill was introduced to rezone Southern Tizon up to, I believe, M1, and the mayor's office had objected to it initially because there was probably unexploded munitions in there, there's contaminated areas, and then eventually that objection was withdrawn, but it's not clear whether that same concern and objection exists with the sports field side. There was another question that was posed, and the question was, how does the transfer affect existing contracts, memorandum of understandings, and agreements? We know of the DPR, Guam Basketball Federation MOU. There is apparently the Guam Raiders football team agreement. Projects and entities within the parcel receiving tax credits, scheduling properties and authorities. Fourth question was, is it possible to sever the basketball gym and exclude it from the transfer due to the existing DPR Guam Basketball Federation MOU? A fifth question was, who would be the scheduling authority and what would be the priority on usage of the separate facilities? These facilities, especially the baseball fields and whatnot, are actually used by various Guam sports organizations. Another question is there any survey or severance costs? Who would bear the expense project? Another question is, what are the plans, if any, for the existing casino? Who owns the structure? Who is responsible for its removal and disposal? So the fact that it's sitting there doesn't necessarily mean that the building belongs to, I guess, Gov Guam. Not clear. If the plan is to continue the casino or gambling in any form, there's a cockpit there that was used before, bingo, etc., for revenue generation. How will the new public law affect that plan? Who is responsible for the removal of the old Liberation Day Carnival structures? Well, there's been some progress in removing some of the structures there, but you still have a lot of the small huts. Now, I guess, is the mayor's office going to be now responsible for cleaning that up when it starts becoming dilapidated and becoming a hazard? 10th question was, has the personal injury case related to the fall off, that young kid, the young man that fell off the climbing tower, has that been resolved? And, is that liability still with Gov Guam, or is that now going to transfer to the Barrigada mayor? 11th question was, should the Barrigada mayor's office be responsible for any facility upgrades that may be needed in the bathrooms, stadium lights, etc.? Who has responsibility for utility expenses and billings? And I think that one is kind of somewhat answered by what happened in Inarahan, where DPR says, we can't afford those lights anymore, they cut it off. And so if the mayor wants it, they're going to have to pay for it. And we found out that that's about a $10 million power bill quarterly in the case of Tizan. Oh, I'm sorry, 10,000. And finally, what is the plan by the Barrigada mayor and MPC relative to revenue sources to offset these operational and maintenance expenses? So these were questions that were posed by in the committee report, and of course we did say that since it still needs to be clarified, and it probably, since it never got responded to, then we probably should be clarified by the sponsor on the floor. And so I just wanted to bring that out, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much.
Senator Castro. Pass? Okay. On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to note a point of order that the committee report lists under written testimony by the Director of the Department of Land Management, but at least in the printed copies, it's not in there. So I do have that letter, and it's over 20 pages long. I think it's very critical that the legislature had considered that before it acts on this bill. It also includes the deeds and the description of the contamination and other things that were of concern to the Department of Land Management. So I think that it really should not have been voted on by the committee without the testimony being in the committee report. And it should absolutely be appended, I don't know how, on the floor, or a supplemental report submitted, and perhaps copied and delivered before we vote on this bill, so that officially that testimony has been considered before we vote. I too have very similar concerns. I was going to read the same list from the committee reports. I'm glad that the chairperson of the committee did. There are questions and that have not been resolved on this bill that I think should be resolved because we're talking about 43 acres. We're not transferring a baseball field or a football field. We're transferring several fields plus, you know, a total of 43 acres. Now, I commend Mayor June Blas and the Vice Mayor. I think that they are very hardworking and they've done much for the village and for the people of Guam. So I appreciate their intentions to ensure that, you know, the children of Barragata, and they've promised, you know, the entire island will have places to play and gather. And I completely trust that under their watch, these fields will be, they'll be maintained and that they will be used and that she will establish some fair rules. But as I told her, even, you know, directly, that my concern is that we can't control mayors, and we don't know who the mayor will be 20 years from now. And this is 43 acres of land from the government of Guam. I think that, well, I want to read from the United States Department of Interior's letter back in September 28, 2000, when it conveyed this 43-acre lot to, well, delivered it to the government of Guam, but delivered it to the Department of Parks and Rec. The second paragraph says, NPS, National Park Service, is pleased to provide for the transfer of Teton Park as needed in addition to recreation facilities in the Barragata area. The property is transferred prior to the completion of remedial action for prior contamination under the terms of an agreement between the Department of Navy and the government of Guam and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This is the CERCLA Act, the same one that the Attorney General is currently suing for contamination of the ORDOT dump and trying to retrieve reimbursement for the government of Guam for the expenses in closing ORDOT. The deed restricts the department from drilling wells on the property and removing soil from an area of a former go-kart track. The deed itself that is attached to this letter, and this is part of the Department of Land Management's testimony. He attaches the letters from the Department of Interior, the deed from the Department of Interior that outlines the CERCLA and how the government of Guam had accepted this property without the cleanup being completed. And that the governor of Guam was then charged with putting in writing whether he deemed the property suitable for human use or not. I also want to point out, similar to a previous speaker, that the mayor has been very successful in working with the Department of Parks and Rec thus far. And Department of Parks and Rec seems to have no objection with the mayor or the municipality's continued administration of the fields that are already established. But when it comes to the undeveloped land, their Department of Recs has concern. I have concern, Mr. Speaker, because I think those lands might come with greater responsibility. They might come with contamination that we are not clear about at this moment. And I think, and we have no plan in front of us. And so I think there's nothing to prevent the legislature from doing this even on a piecemeal basis, you know, for those things that we can actually predict. For example, the current football fields, the current baseball fields, the tennis court. If Department of Parks and Recs has no objection to that, then I have no objection to those being transferred, and I think those can continue to be used. So in other words, yeah, I would support more just a transfer of the existing facilities, but the potential to develop, its Department of Parks and Rec actually lays out, and if I may read their letter too, they lay out their plans. So they say, DPR does not support the transferring of the Teton Gymnasium, which is currently under lease, and all other undeveloped land area within Lot Naval Air Station Hagana 19, currently under the jurisdiction and administration of the department. DPR is currently in the planning phase of developing a central sports complex within the subject parcel to address the current demand placed on the DPR Northern Sports Complex in Dedido. I would like to give both DPR and the mayor Barrigada, the opportunity to work together to further develop these properties prior to any cutting off of DPR from this capability. I think if they've already got plans or they're working on plans, and they do, it is their mandate to address the, you know, the overburden on the Dedido Sports Complex, on the Agatna Pool, and or whatever other facilities that they currently manage for the entire island. So I just think that if we could hold off on the other portions of this property, then that's what we should do in order to give Parks and Rec time to further work on their plans. The other thing is that I'm not very certain what is the problem with just allowing a Department of Parks and Rec and the mayors to enter into memorandums of understanding. I think that is what happened for years and years, that the Department of Parks and Rec controlled facilities in the villages, basketball courts, and the mayors were able to help maintain them, to conduct activities, sports activities, and of course, we probably could share stories where they had conflicts, you know, personalities or something, but I don't think that's the case here. I think the mayor has been exceptional in working with DPR and getting these facilities under, you know, that she's very much in control of how these are being used. Again, I raise my concern as to, yeah, what is the meaning of transferring the land? Does it preclude DPR from further putting in any facilities? Does it allow, I'm glad we came up with the floor amendment that prevents further transfer. That's it for my objections on the bill, Mr. Speaker. So I would ask that just we narrow this bill down before we pass it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator.
Mr. Speaker, I request that we set this bill aside while I try to obtain as many answers to the questions that were posed.
I have no objections to that, but I would also like to see a copy. I've not seen the copy that the Vice Speaker was speaking about, and so if that could be disseminated, I would appreciate to have a copy of that as well.
We'll arrange to have the land management letter with the attached documents circulated. And this bill is set aside. We will recess until 2 o'clock